All right, well, welcome everybody. This is Trolleyology, a look back at the trolleys of Irwin. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the coordinator of volunteers, public programs, and public outreach at the museum. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to those who have attended our previous virtual programs. Welcome back. Over the next few weeks, museum staff, volunteers, and members will be sharing programs featuring Pennsylvania transit history topics and tales of our collection that you can enjoy from the comfort of your home. And you can see the full list of upcoming presentations at our website, patrolley.org, which I can share in the chat box in just a few minutes, so you can click on it directly. Now, we have some people who have visited the museum before, some who volunteer here, and for those who are new to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, I want to introduce it to you a little bit. We were established in 1954 as the Arden Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club, and the museum opened to visitors a few years later in 1963. The museum is located along the route of the interurban between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA, and here you'll find almost 50 trolleys and electric railway cars, about 20 of which operate. About 30,000 people per year take our 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. And now I would like to introduce our presenter today, Andy Blanco. Andy is a civil engineer by training and has been interested in all forms of transportation since he was a small child. He's currently the Director of Engineering and Planning for South Fayette Township. He's also a volunteer at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, where he helps with our scouting programs, Operation Lifesaver presentations, and more recently, in the archives. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session with our presenter, but the chat box will be open throughout the presentation, so please feel free to enter questions and comments during the show, and Andy can see those, read through them at the end. And please keep your microphones muted like they are now, and we'll go ahead and turn off our videos, except for Andy, and that'll make sure he has all the bandwidth available for the slideshow. All right, so now I am going to spotlight Andy's video here because he's gonna take it away.
Thank you, Kristen. Before we get into the PowerPoint, I just wanted to share this with you. This presentation was first given in March of 2014 for the Norwin Library. And I'll explain a little bit about how that came to be once we get into the slides. But had we been meeting in person, each of you would have received a little souvenir ticket from West Penn Railways, which is always fun to just set the mood for what we're about to undergo. So with that, let's see if I can share my screen. Well, first of all, I have to tell you this is very intimidating to give a talk about trolleys to some of the world's greatest experts in trolleys. I am sure many of you know far more about this than I do, and I will say that every time I give a presentation, I usually walk away learning more than people learn from me. So please, at the end or in the chat box, if you have any additional information that you'd like to share, please let me know, and I will make sure that I update the presentation and include that in future versions. There we go. Okay, this journey all began, I'm going to say about 10 years ago, with a coworker who gave me a reproduction old postcard of the railroad underpass in Irwin Borough. And he said, "Have you ever seen this?" And I said, "Wait a minute, that really looks familiar. I recognize that stone underpass." He said, "That's Irwin Station." I said, "There's no station in Irwin." He said, "There used to be." And that set me in motion because I was so curious about what happened to the station and how the scene here has changed over the years. And I ended up doing quite a bit of research, and I gave a presentation for the Norwin Public Library called In Search of Irwin Station. Probably a year after that, a representative of the Lincoln Highway Heritage Corridor came and gave a wonderful presentation about the history of the Lincoln Highway. I know the librarian, and I said to her, you know, this would be really fun. We could do a whole presentation, a series, if you will, on transportation topics surrounding Irwin Borough. I said, there could be one on the trolleys. There could be one on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And she said, great, Andy, when do you want to do them? I said, wait a minute, I wasn't volunteering. And she said, but who better? So I said, well, I'm not going to give a talk about something I don't know anything about, but I will start researching these things. And indeed, this presentation came out of that research, and then eventually a presentation about the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So with that, let's continue on our journey here. Who remembers clang, clang, clang went the trolley, ding, ding, ding went the bell? That was called the Trolley Song from a 1944 movie called Meet Me in St. Louis, and it was sung by Judy Garland. That song is a great way to start this presentation off because it harkens back to a day when things were simpler, life was easier, people knew everybody that lived on their street. You may or may not have had an automobile, so you took the trolleys everywhere. People would take them to shop, to get to church, to get to work, to visit friends, and it was a wonderful way to get around. Unfortunately, the era did not last long enough. But our friend Mr. Rogers, he recognized the nostalgic value of trolleys and used them often in his show with the trolley to the land of make-believe. I should note that that song with Judy Garland was actually nominated for an Oscar. The trolleys were a very big part of Irwin in the first half of the 20th century. What you're seeing on the left there is one of a half dozen murals that the Lincoln Highway Heritage Corridor commissioned. This one is on the side of a building in Irwin, and featured prominently front and center in that mural is a trolley car coming down the street in Irwin. Service eventually went from Irwin to Trafford, to Greensburg, to Mckeesport, and to Hermione, and we will talk about each one of those lines. Now again, I apologize if some of this is old information to you. To the general public who doesn't have the faintest idea what a trolley is, this is great background. Trolleys were introduced when walking and horses were the most common methods of transportation. With the introduction of trolleys, people could live farther than walking distance from their jobs, which had been a limitation in the past. The social ramifications of that are enormous. Prior to trolleys, people had to work within walking distance of their homes. Now you could live in the suburbs, you could live in another town, and you could take a trolley to get to work, and it opened up so many more opportunities for people to seek employment. Many street railway companies were formed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They were typically undercapitalized. Most of the early railways were quickly overwhelmed by the realities of the marketplace. The cost of construction was high, while the patronage was as limited as the geographical area served. Reorganization became the euphemism for bankruptcy. Now, what's a trolley versus what's a streetcar? All four of these pictures show streetcars, but none of them show trolleys. All trolleys are streetcars, but not all streetcars are trolleys. Trolleys get their power from an overhead wire, and that little wheel on top of the pole is called the trolley. And then the pole comes down, called the trolley pole, and conveys that electricity into the inside of the trolley car where there are traction motors that power each of the axles. Newer systems actually have a pantograph, which is less prone to being derailed, if you will, from the wire. Pittsburgh's LRV has that, and most other cities that are using light rail have that as well. Washington, D.C. had a very interesting system. It was felt that the overhead wires for trolleys were unsightly. And so Washington, D.C., and actually New York as well, mandated that power feeds be placed below ground. So they had a contact system that went down through a slot in the street, very similar to the cable cars in San Francisco, and it picked up electricity from a single wire that was located underneath a slot situated between the steel rails. Trolleys were great for southwestern Pennsylvania because they could climb grades as steep as 12%, and we certainly have plenty of those. The first trolley line in Westmoreland County was a 5-mile loop in Greensburg, which was built in 1899. The line then extended west towards Jeannette, which was the next major city, and had a number of glass plants. To this day, Jeannette is still known as the Glass City. And then on to Manor, which was not a big industrial center, but it certainly was where people who worked in Jeannette lived. The line continued west and eventually reached Erwin via Penborough and Manor in 1900. So pretty aggressive construction schedule. Initially, the Pittsburgh, Mckeesport, and Greensburg Railway, this route eventually became part of West Penn Railways. Here's an old postcard looking down Main Street in Irwin towards North Irwin. And if you're observant, you'll notice something is missing. It's got streetcar tracks, but there's no overhead wires. I assure you, the first streetcars that made it to Irwin were trolleys and ran on electricity from overhead wires. What I learned is that oftentimes interesting scenes would find their way to Germany, where artists would take a photograph and create a colored postcard out of it. But they took great liberty to alter scenes to make them more attractive. And I guess they didn't understand that without overhead wires, you had no streetcars or trolleys. So they edited all of those out of the picture. So I don't think they happened to get there on the exact day when the wires hadn't gone up yet, but the rails had. I just want to point out between this slide and the next one, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but there's a white house on the hill in North Irwin Borough, right smack above the tracks. That house is still there today. So certainly the rest of the postcard was very true to the prototype. This is that scene today. Obviously no trolley tracks, but other than that, it looks remarkably similar. Here's a later postcard, also looking down Main Street towards North Irwin. Now this scene actually includes a trolley car, but still no poles. Here's an early black and white photo taken at the corner of Main Street and 4th Avenue in Irwin. And I thought it was very interesting that with old black and white photos, you really don't know what colors the objects in the photos were. So we know from narratives that the original West Penn Railways cars were painted dark red. Then they went to dark green, presumably because it was easier to keep those cars clean. But there was a terrible accident in which somebody was killed in 1917, and the following year, in 1918, they started painting the cars orange. And that is the quintessential color that we think of when we think of West Penn Railways. This is an aerial view of downtown Irwin showing the various lines which eventually went to different towns. Main Street today is a one-way street, but there was the yellow line is the West Penn Railways line that went to Greensburg. And the red line towards the bottom of the screen is a bridge that crosses the Tinker's Run Valley at 4th Street. That line continued on to Trafford. And the fuchsia or purple line in the bottom right corner, that is the line that went on to Harmony and Mckeesport. You'll see in a moment why it was not a loop in downtown Irwin. I apologize. That's 2 more slides. All right, trolleys went as far as 2nd Street, where they served the Brunswick Hotel, which is opposite what today is the post office. I may remember to do this later on, but I don't want to miss it. Do you notice anything missing from the front of this trolley car? The headlight. I am told that, first of all, they would only have one headlight on a car, and they would move it from end to end, depending on which way the trolley car was moving. But they would also take it in during the daytime. So obviously this was a daytime shot. There was no reason to have the headlight out. When it was time, the conductor or motorman would bring that headlight out and hang it on that bracket at the front of the car. But kind of odd to see one without the headlight. This was the slide that I wanted to make sure I pointed out. Right at the top of that hill, actually you can see where the tracks end, right there. And had the trolleys come down this hill to meet the railroad tracks, which is where this photo was taken from, it would never have made it back up the hill. So passengers that wanted to get off the train and get onto the trolley had to walk up that pretty steep grade for a long block before they would get up to the tracks. And I understand that the trolley, if it was running ahead of schedule, it would actually come down to the end of Main Street there, stop, reverse the pole, and just wait until the appointed time to leave on its run. So that was a great place to catch it. There was a lot of pride working for a trolley company. The pay was not bad, the working conditions were clean and out of the weather, and the positions were unionized after 1938. Here's a photo of the conductor and the motorman in front of a West Penn Railways car. The conductors and motormen wore starched white shirts, ties, and navy wool uniform trousers and coats with brass buttons. That's what is being held in the bottom left corner there. I initially, when I saw that, I thought it was a token, but then doing some more research found out that West Penn Railways always worked on cash fare. They did not sell tokens. But that was a uniform button, much like what would have been on their jackets. By the way, the fare in 1920 was 5 cents. Most of the employees stayed in their jobs for decades. 2-man crews were eliminated in the mid-1920s to 1930 as a cost-cutting measure. And I think that's all I have to say about that one. The cars progressed over the years from a very simple 2-axle short car like this. Here's open-air cars that were used in the summertime. Here's a full car with trucks at each end with 2 axles on each truck. As ridership grew, longer cars with trucks at each end became the norm. Early cars, like some of the ones we saw there, were made of wood, while later cars were made of steel. We talked about the colors of the cars. I would say the most prevalent cars used by West Penn Railway were the ones with the distinctive center door interurban cars, as you see here. These, by the way, never did run in Irwin because the wheelbase was too long. Those were the 700 series cars, and 40 of these cars were built between 1910 and 1925. Car number 739 has been preserved and is on display at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum in Washington, PA. West Penn Railways was building a network of service lines all around the Pittsburgh area. Pittsburgh and Allegheny County were largely served by Pittsburgh Railway Company. The main artery was from Greensburg to Uniontown, and the company was headquartered in Connellsville, midway in between. Much care was given to the design and manufacture of the destination signs. Due to the then high illiteracy rate among immigrants who rode lines to and from the coal mines, the signs were color-coded with no 2 connecting routes using the same colors. The Erwin line, for instance, used white letters on a black background, while the main line to Uniontown used white letters on a red background. Other schemes included white on green for the Latrobe to Hecla Junction route, black on yellow, and red on cream. Like the fact that trolley lines enabled people to live further from their job than what they could walk, I thought this was probably the second most fascinating thing I learned in my research. I always thought that was just help you and I, it would stand out further down the road if we saw what color was coming. But no, it was because a lot of people couldn't read the words. So the line from Irwin to Greensburg included a lot of little towns: Manor, Penn, Jeanette, Oakford Park, and Country Club, which is where Greensburg Country Club is now. So let's set off on that journey to Greensburg like we would have in the old days on a trolley car. Here's an old postcard of Pennsylvania Avenue from Cedar Avenue looking towards Irwin. And you can see there was a single track. So the timing was such, the schedule was such that there were certain passing sidings along the way, and that's where trolley cars would have to meet. If they got there first, they would pull it onto the siding and wait for the other car to come. But they could never pass each other on the main line because it was just a single track. Here's that same view today, minus the tracks, minus the overhead wires. This is turning around and looking the other way, looking towards Greensburg. Very interesting here because the tracks left the roadway and now became a dedicated right-of-way on the south side of Pennsylvania Avenue as it climbed the hill. Note that there are two sets of electric poles, one on each side of the street, but then a third set over on the right, which served as the opposite end of the wires that would hold the horizontal lines for the trolley poles. Here's that same view today. And there we go. I believe it's this house that you can see in both views. This will be the house here. Yep. I'm sorry, it's this one, that first one. So that house is still there today. This was Pennsylvania Avenue School. It is now a elderly care convalescent home. If you were to go out to Pennsylvania Avenue today and stand on what was once the tracks, you'll see that, in fact, that second or third set of poles still exists. So the tracks ran right down the middle alongside Pennsylvania Avenue. I found that that's a great way to find where old streetcar lines were because the power companies had a right-of-way there. They weren't about to redo all their wiring and abandon their right-of-ways just because the trolleys weren't running anymore. So a lot of times when you see overhead wires that don't necessarily run right next to the road, very likely that may have been a streetcar line. The electric railway or trolley line is shown on these old USGS topographic maps. They show it as an electric railroad, and you can see it followed Pennsylvania out to this point right here. That would be very close to where the turnpike crosses Pennsylvania Avenue now. And then the trolley line veered off of the road and went through the backyards. And sure enough, if you look at an aerial photo from 1957, you can make out that trolley line scooting right through the backyards at the base of the hill. Bird's eye view, even though it's long gone, you can kind of see the clearing through the trees where that line went. And indeed, when I was preparing this presentation, I had noticed this before and never realized why it was there. There's an overhead electric line going through backyards that does not follow a street in any way, shape, or form. That was the overhead wires that powered the trolley cars. Then the line continued on Stickle Lane and went on to, lo and behold, Trolley Street, which took the line down into Manor Borough. And all the way down at the bottom at Race Street and Penn Manor Road, here's the sign for Penn Manor Road, there's the sign for Trolley Street. Again, I find when you can find old street signs, it's amazing how many streets are named Railroad Street or Trolley Street or Depot Street, and that's very likely where they led back in the day. Here is a picture of the first passing siding coming east from Irwin. This was in Penn Borough, which is along that Penn Manor Road that was in the last slide. And you can see the area was wide enough for two trolley cars to pass each other. Whichever one got there first pulled over, waited for the other one. This picture was taken on May 31st, 1952. The Irwin line was abandoned that summer. So you can see that the right-of-way was pretty choked with weeds. I'm told that that was not uncommon on West Penn Railway's lines, especially as it got to the end. That was deferred maintenance that they weren't going to spend money on. If you've ever been from Penn into Jeannette, the road eventually parallels the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is right here. Here's some relay boxes and a signal tower. That scene looks virtually unchanged today, although that overhead signal bridge is gone. But there are a lot of pictures here. I think this was a great place to get pictures because there were two tracks and you could oftentimes catch pictures of a meet. And there we do have a meet. Both of those are Greensburg to Irwin cars. You can tell by the signboards. Car number 292 and 286. Now, I don't fully understand this, and when we get to the end of the presentation, I'll bet one of you can fill me in. There are lights on these cars, and I understand that it had something to do with the signaling as to when those lights were illuminated and when they weren't. So maybe somebody can share that knowledge with me if you know what it was. Note also that there's no headlights on these cars because it was during the day and they were only placed out at night. And I note on the left car, the sign, the advertising sign says swim at Oakford Park, which takes us to our next slide. Oakford Park was a typical trolley amusement park. It was located on the east side of Jeannette in a valley. They had a lake. They had a large swimming pool, amusement park rides, very typical of the trolley parks that sprang up around the turn of the century. Other local trolley parks included Olympia Park in Mckeesport, which was in business from 1902 to 1942, Westview Park in Westview Borough in the North Hills, that was in business from 1910 to 1977, and of course Kennywood Park, which is still thriving today. Like most trolley parks, Oakford Park was initially a picnic grove, but then evolved into an amusement park. It is estimated that there were between 1,500 and 2,000 similar trolley parks across the U.S. in 1919. A huge dance hall was added in 1908, and there were Sunday concerts and seasonal entertainment. It is reported that this is where the Three Stooges got their start. On July 5th, 1903, intense rain began to fall as the park was filled to capacity. People took shelter in the pavilions and the streetcar waiting room to ride out the storm. Around 5:30 p.m., the earthen embankment on a man-made lake collapsed under the strain, sending a wall of water 6 feet high through the park. The rush of water continued down Brush Creek, taking 21 lives. Trolleys derailed and tumbled off their tracks, and bridges as far away as Erwin were swept away, including, interestingly enough, the original Erwin train station, which was built spanning Brush Creek. Restoration of the park began immediately, although the lake was never rebuilt. It was eventually replaced with an enormous swimming pool, which was still used when the park closed in the 1970s. Okay, so now let's talk about going west from Irwin. I hate to read slides when you can read them yourself, but in essence, they started to lay line west from Irwin towards Trafford in 1903. There were small towns along the way. Cabotsville, they hit in 1904, Ardera in 1905. And you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, they laid the entire line from Greensburg to Irwin in a year. Why did it take them so long to get to Trafford? It took them so long because the route was an incredible engineering feat of going through a valley. 9 bridges were built to cross the steep-walled valleys, Brush Creek, and the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. In fact, over 8% of the 5.5-mile route consisted of bridges. The first trolley ran from Trafford to Ardera on November 20th, 1905. Now, the bridge to 4th Street in Irwin was completed in 1906, but Irwin Borough Council would not allow the last 250 feet of track to be built to connect to Main Street in a bitter dispute over the price of a franchise for that short section of track. So for 5 years, the trolley line was not able to get into downtown Irwin Borough until that was finally resolved. The Republican Standard, which was a newspaper, described the trolley line in 1906 as one of the most picturesque routes in the state. I am greatly indebted to a North Irwin resident who passed away about a year ago. He gave me a copy of this little book called the Trafford Trolleys, which tells you everything you could ever want to know about this route between Irwin and Trafford. So I do have a couple of diagrams from this book in the presentation. Here's the first one. What I did here was to circle in blue all of the bridges that were built on this line. And you remember I said 8% of the total route, 5.5 miles, was on overhead bridges. So it was an incredible feat, and that's why it took so long to build, and you can imagine at great expense. At Trafford, West Penn Railways met Pittsburgh Railways Company, and their line continued through the Turtle Creek Valley, Pitcairn, Wilmerding, Turtle Creek, East Pittsburgh, Braddock, etc., into downtown Pittsburgh. Here was the loop where West Penn met Pittsburgh Railways, a West Penn Railways car on the left, on the right, and a Pittsburgh Railways car on the left. That route, that loop there is still visible today. When they haven't paved it for a few years, you can see the rails starting to show through, or at least the cracks above them. It's not hard to find. Best fish sandwich I've ever had is right up the road here at Keith Heinrich's Catering, for those of you that enjoy food. Now, as we continue going towards Irwin along Route 993, you'll come to an area where, again, you'll notice that the electric poles set back from the road a bit. And this is where the trolley line was exactly next to the Pennsylvania Railroad. There was even a Cabotsville yard there at the time, which could handle additional overflow from Pitcairn Yard, which was a major classification yard for the Pennsylvania Railroad in the mid-1900s. The Coal Hill Viaduct, shown here under construction, is 550 feet long by 90 feet high. You can see the horseshoe-shaped brackets here that would carry the wires across the bridge. And this is Haywood Road, sits up here on the hill behind it. Catch up with my notes here and make sure I'm not missing anything important. I think we got it. Here's a view once that bridge was finished with a West Penn Railways car crossing it. This is 1939. And again, looking at old aerial photos, one of my favorite things to do. Here's an aerial photo from 1939. You can just faintly make out the bridge crossing the valley there, which I've circled in blue. I had driven past it 100 times, never thought anything about it. But if you go out in the field, knowing that the bridge was there at one time, you can still find concrete bridge abutment at Baker School Road here and on the other end at Haywood Road. And here's your line of electric poles running right up from that valley. This is looking towards Trafford. This is looking away from Trafford. But this pole would be probably that pole right there.
Andy, we got a comment from George Gula. He says he was there a few months ago, and the PCC loop and West Penn track are poking through the pavement.
There you go. If you don't take the rails out, sooner or later, they will poke through the asphalt. No doubt about it. The Larimer Trestle was very interesting. It was also multiple hundreds of feet long, 551 feet. Most noteworthy because it crossed the Pennsylvania Railroad main line, which at the time would have been 4 tracks. Here's a beautiful black and white photo looking at the trestle. This would be from the north end of the bridge, looking towards the little town of Larimer. Pennsylvania Railroad tracks down here. And you'll note that there are railings or fences along the railroad tracks. I'm just going to leave that with you because if you ever see my presentation on In Search of Irwin Station, I'll explain why those were there and how they used them. Here's a postcard showing that same bridge, although here looking in the opposite direction. This siding right here went to a coal mine. I'm sorry to say I don't know off the top of my head which coal mine it was, but that valley was just littered with coal mines everywhere. And today, of course, with mine drainage. Here's a rare shot taken from inside the trolley car looking across that trestle. And if you go out and look today, again, knowing from my research that the bridge was there, there's the concrete piers that supported the bridge right before it crosses over the main line of the railroad. And a bridge abutment, another one, overgrown, but it's there. This is very interesting. If you know the area and you've ever driven along Route 993, you've seen this wall. Well, again, this study of old aerial photographs, the highway, Route 993, was not built until after the streetcar line. So when they put in the highway to lower that vertical curve a little bit, they came down an extra 4 or 5 feet, and they had to build a wall to support the trolley line, which is right up here on the hillside, as you can see by the electric poles. That wall is falling apart, and in fact, pieces of it were replaced by PennDOT last year that had failed, and they've now got big stone in there to support the hillside. Here's a fascinating picture. It was clearly identified in this photo that it was in Larimer, but I couldn't quite figure out where this all sat. If you look just over the top of that building, there's the top of the truss of that bridge. So the track came up here, turned about 60 degrees, went across that bridge to the other side of the valley, and then continued on towards Trafford. I thought this was interesting too. I guess that was Atlantic Gasoline, and I don't know if that was their trademark name for their premium gasoline, but Atlantic White Flash. Okay, continuing to the east towards Irwin Borough, Brush Creek does a lot of interesting loops in through here. Again, I don't want to give away my Irwin Station presentation, but the Pennsylvania Railroad cut off a loop of Brush Creek. Brush Creek is right here. Originally, it was over here. But they chose for the streetcar line to keep it up on the hillside because this was not heavily populated. I guess they figured they wouldn't lose a lot of ridership. So there is a clearing that you can see along the top of the hill through the woods. That was the streetcar line. And if you look at property maps, you can still see the right-of-way, which is a separate piece of property, through much of this area, through an area called Riddinger Park. The next bridge coming towards Irwin was this bridge here, very high, although not terribly long. If you go out and look, you can still see the bridge abutments behind this mustard yellow house, which is on 993. And finally, the line reached Irwin. There are very few pictures of this bridge, but this is where the trolley line came into Irwin. And I am guessing that this blockade here was sometime between that 1906 and 1911, when Irwin Borough would not allow the trolley to come into town. Alternatively, that could be maybe when the trolley line was abandoned before the bridge was taken down, but in any event, you can see no trolley was going to come through that blockade. There is a photo of a trolley car coming across that bridge. There aren't a lot of photos of this, so that's pretty exciting to me to find that. And a friend of mine actually gave me this last year. This is an old shot looking south from the Pennsylvania Railroad, looking up the Tinker's Run Valley. Most people would look at this and they'd see railroad tracks in the lumber yard. He looked at it and said, oh my gosh, that's the trolley bridge that crossed the valley coming into Irwin. So Irwin Borough is over here. This is the line that was finished but couldn't be used for 5 years. I was out on a complaint when I worked for North Huntington Township, probably 5 or 6 years ago. And it was in winter, and I was up there kind of doing some surveillance on the property and a scrapyard that sat down in the valley. And one minute I'm walking in snow-covered grass, and the next minute I'm standing on something really hard. And I thought, this is odd. Why would there be something hard here at the edge of the hill? What I didn't realize until I looked on the other side too, it was the bridge abutment from that old bridge. So the bridges were taken down, but the abutments were often left in place. The bridge on the left is absolutely not the bridge coming into Irwin. I believe Ed Lieberger told me this is somewhere down around Charleroi, but I take it to show the fact that there were no sidewalks on these bridges. And I've heard stories from old timers in Irwin that they would walk to the movie theater and spend the car fare that their parents had given them on popcorn or candy at the concession stand, and then walked home because they didn't have the 5-cent trolley fare anymore. That was great as long as the trolley didn't come. These guys on the right, I guess they thought that was a great place to take their maybe high school senior picture. Hopefully they didn't get caught by a trolley car coming across the bridge, because there really was no place to go except to run. Finally, we get to Irwin. This is looking into Irwin from that bridge. This is where 4th Street hits Main Street. And you're going to call me a liar, because there's one of the longer center step streetcars, which I said never made it to Irwin, but obviously that one did. Okay, that's the way that scene looks today. There's a Rite Aid. Actually, that Rite Aid closed about 1.5 years ago, sorry to say. But if you're looking for a great place to put a restaurant or a store, Irwin would make a good spot. Now, the next leg of our journey is going to take us to Mckeesport. This is a photo of Pennsylvania Avenue and Main Street coming into Irwin. I didn't take it because of, well, I didn't take it at all. I captured this. But what's interesting here is that you can see the streetcar tracks coming this way to go to Mckeesport, while the streetcar tracks there went to Greensburg. I don't know what kind of an arrangement they had worked out. Obviously, you couldn't get to Mckeesport directly. You had to go into Irwin, but it was a completely separate streetcar company, but they must have had some type of an arrangement to share those tracks. In March 1906, a charter was granted to the Pittsburgh and Westmoreland Street Railway Company to build a line from Irwin to Hermione. The line was built as far as Hawntown, but then it was diverted to Mckeesport. I guess somebody figured there was more ridership going that way. In March of 1906, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. That's it. Okay, next slide. This is a shot looking up Main Street towards a little area called Hawntown, which is where the Westinghouse mica plant, and before that, there was actually a cereal plant there where they made puffed rice, like shot from guns. And for many, many years, the area where that plant was located is called Cereal Hill. So as you look up this street, it looks at that time that it wasn't even really paved. But interesting, there is clearly a streetcar line on the right, and that was the track that went to Mckeesport. You can see the utility poles that held that wire, but pay attention to the left side of the road too. Because later on, a second streetcar line was built to Harmony. That line went up this road while the Mckeesport line was on this side of this road. I believe they may have eventually come together in Irwin. Well, they had to, because that last picture showed the line coming from Main Street. But I would love to know more about how the lines got from point A to point B here. Okay, on to Mckeesport. This line, I've only ever seen one photo of this bridge, but this was the bridge that took the line across the valley, looking up on the hillside there. That would be the area known as Fairmont. And today, if you were to go out and look, this house is very clearly still there with the 3 levels and the porch on the 2nd floor. Although there are other buildings in this area now, it would be very tough to see in this view. That line crossed Tinker's Run Park. That's the baseball field there. And that house that I just talked about is located along Main Street, somewhere right in here, one of these homes. You can see also in these contour lines the topography of how this was built up to support the trolley line as it got to the bridge abutment and then crossed the valley. And then you can see the grading that was done over here to expand that out to the end of the bridge, so the bridge didn't have to be quite so long. You can really learn a lot studying contour lines. Now, regarding Mckeesport, this could be a presentation in itself, because we don't even get, if you look at the ancestry, you don't even get to West Penn Railways until April of 1917, and you've got all of these predecessor companies that eventually became West Penn Railways. I recently learned of this book called Mckeesport Trolleys by Ron Beal, and I'd like to get my hands on that. I'm sure there is another presentation here on the trolley lines that went to Mckeesport. And finally, the last leg of our journey takes us to Harmony. The Erwin Harmony Traction Company was chartered to run a line from Irwin to Harmony around 1908. The line went through Hawntown, past the present-day Banco Industrial Park, under Farview Drive, and then followed Clay Pike. Construction was complete to the northern part of Harmony in a year, 1909. And you'll see why it took a little longer to get to the southern part of Harmony. The bridge across Sewickley Creek into Harmony was not completed until 1910. This is one of the few photos I've been able to find of one of their trolley cars. Have no idea what color that was. Could have been dark red, could have been dark green, could have been navy, who knows. This was our car barn. It was located on Pennsylvania Avenue in Irwin, and that building looks remarkably similar today. There it is. You can see they've filled in the windows on the 2nd floor. The garage looks a little bit differently. But I found, I also am a big bourbon aficionado, and I have a presentation about bourbon and local distilleries. This was the Crescent Brewing Company, which was around in the early 1900s. And looking at this photo the other night, I realized, oh my gosh, there's the car barn right there. And that is a streetcar, a Harmony Line streetcar sitting outside on the apron outside of the car barn. Here's Main Street, like that picture we showed. but it looks like this streetcar line sat up on the hill above Main Street. This is what today is Queen of Angels School. I believe this was Irwin High School. This may have been at the junior high at a later time. I'm not as good on the school history as I am on the transportation history. But clearly, the streetcar line, at least the one going to Hermione, was up here on the hill. That may be the Mckeesport line here on the lower side of Main Street. And looking at an aerial view, this is the Queen of Angels School today. This is Route 30, which was not built until 1937, 1938. So that last picture, the Route 30 highway bridge would have been right here, and its supporting pier would have been right about where that streetcar line is, but it was gone by 1937. Okay, again, here's that look up Main Street. This is where the streetcar track was laid. It went up a pretty good grade there. And if you go out and look, especially in the winter when the leaves are off the trees, there's the bridge abutment where that streetcar line crossed what's today known as Laurel Avenue. Now, an often misunderstood local folklore tale here is that the Pennsylvania Railroad and the trolley lines shared a tunnel that went beneath Farview Drive behind Banco Industrial Park. All of you being trolley aficionados, you know that can't be the case because the gauge was different. The trolley line could never have used the same track as the railroad did. In fact, if you look at old aerial photos, this is Banco Industrial Park, where the cereal plant was. Here's the railroad line, and you can see it just disappears in a tunnel that takes it underneath Farview Drive, and then it comes out on this end. The streetcar line, to the contrary, could climb a steeper grade. It climbed the hill, went over top of the hill, and then came down on the other side to roughly the same elevation as the railroad. And if you look again at the contour lines, here was the cut that was made for the trolley line, and this is Farview Drive that I mentioned. Farview Drive actually had a little bridge that took the street across the trolley line. This was the excavation that took place for the tunnel that took the Pennsylvania Railroad through the hillside and then came out on this end. You can see that was at a much lower elevation because the railroad wasn't able to climb that steep of a grade. On the way to Hermione, you go through a little town called Wilton. Somebody gave me a scan of this old postcard, which I thought was very picturesque. I didn't realize just how picturesque until I went out in the field and saw that that house is still there today. Different color, but the streetcar tracks were just right here to the left of it. This is the road that eventually takes you to West Newton. Here was the bridge that they built in 1909 and opened up in April of 1910, going into Hermione. And this is a side view of it with a trolley car on it. You can see that was a pretty steep grade for a trolley car to manage to pull to get up that line to head towards Erwin. In the early 1920s, West Penn Railways controlled and operated over 339 miles of track, representing a consolidation of 62 companies which had entered the street railway business soon after the successful application of electrification in the late 19th century. Many of these small railways were economically unsuccessful. They didn't have enough riders because they were disconnected from one another, unable to attract the through traffic that might have ensured their viability. What did West Penn Railways have that the others did not? A power company. West Penn Power is the successor, or actually it was the parent company, if you will, of West Penn Railways, so they didn't have to pay for electric power. And it certainly made the operation more affordable. I am told that West Penn Power knew in the 1920s that this whole system was not sustainable and they were losing money on it, but they kept it going because they thought it was a necessary public service, which is interesting. In today's day and age, I would question if that would ever happen. So what happened to West Penn Railways and all the trolley car companies? Trolley lines were generally slow. They could only follow the rails. Once automobiles came along, that didn't hold you back anymore. New lines had a very high capital cost to construct them. There were costs to maintain the private right-of-ways. They weren't running on a publicly funded road like a bus would. West Penn Railway's last new trolley cars were purchased in 1929, so there was little reinvestment in the system. The General Motors conspiracy that you probably have heard about, that General Motors bought trolley companies just to shut them down so that they could replace them with their buses, which they produced. In the 1920s, automobiles became affordable and within reach of the average family. So if they had an automobile, they didn't need to ride the trolley anymore. And frankly, the trolley lines were never profitable. They could meet their operating costs, but they could never meet their debt service. So the accountants knew by 1930 that they would go out of business, and it was just a question of when. Finally, trolley tracks in the center of urban streets posed problems for automobiles, and the number of automobiles just kept growing. Here's a picture of the Erwin Harmony Traction Company replacement. This was a rubber-tired bus. The line to Harmony ceased operations in 1931. West Penn Railway ceased operations to Mckeesport in 1938, the same year that Route 30 was built in its present alignment. Ceased operations to Trafford in 1942, and then they did continue on to Larimer, but they must have reversed the trolley pole and just come back to Erwin from there because there was no loop at Larimer. But they ceased operations to Larimer in January 1948. Here's a photo of the very last car that went to Larimer on the last run, 11:35 p.m. on January 3rd of 48. West Penn Railway ceased operations between Irwin and Greensburg on July 12th, 1952. Here is a sign advertising that. And then up in the upper left corner, a parting shot, I guess, at the end of one of the runs. Just a couple of photos I threw in here. This is not West Penn Railways in the upper right corner. I believe that was in Los Angeles. But the trolley cars were just junked. If they were metal, they were scrapped. If they were wood, they were often burned. Lower left corner here, here's a photo of that Harmony Irwin trolley car barn. You can see it became a gas station once it was no longer used for the streetcars. But you can still see the streetcar tracks running into it at this time, which is kind of unique. If you didn't realize that had been a car barn, you might not have even noticed that. And then in the bottom right corner, as soon as the trolley lines were shut down, they were in there ripping up the tracks. I guess they were a liability, and they wanted to get those out of there as soon as they could. So here they are in downtown Irwin being ripped up. Interesting that the building there in front of there is the West Penn Power Company local office, and upstairs is the Irwin Borough office. You can see the sign there, Fire and Police. West Penn Railways made a short-lived attempt to continue transit with buses. That started in 1950, but it was not an economic success, and it was discontinued in 1953. This picture, was taken in Greensburg. A rare shot of both a bus and a trolley, both owned by West Penn Railways. So is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Maybe. A lot of cities have preserved their old right-of-ways and are using them for light rail. I believe that's San Diego in the upper left, Ottawa, Canada, I believe, in the upper right, Philadelphia in the lower right, and of course Pittsburgh in the lower left. If you've still got the right-of-ways, it's certainly a viable means of transportation, although almost impossible to go out now and acquire right-of-ways. It would be cost prohibitive. A lot of towns have also used trolley lines in historic parts of the town as a tourist attraction, so that people can come in and get around these historic areas in a vintage mode of transportation. And if you have never been to New Orleans, I cannot recommend it enough. Even my wife, who is not a rail fan, admitted that she had a great time taking a ride one afternoon on the St. Charles line in New Orleans, out into the suburbs with beautiful greenery, beautiful old architecture. That honestly is the trip of a lifetime. So I would like to acknowledge people who helped me gather information for this. Bernie Solomon, who was a member of the North Huntington Township Planning Commission. Bill Hillier, who was the North Irwin historian I mentioned, who gave me the Trafford Trolleys book. Ed Lieberger, who dealt with countless questions from me 6 or 7 years ago as I researched this program. I understand he has moved. I think somebody said he's over near Philadelphia now. And of course, you're all very familiar with the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. I don't know if you're familiar with a website which was actually taken down for a couple of years. There was some kind of a dispute, but it is back up and running, Pittsburgh Transit Info. This guy is a retired bus driver from the Port Authority. He has more information on there than you can imagine. And then those historic aerial photographs that I got are on a website called penpilot.psu.edu. And it's a lot of geographical maps and information that Penn State has in their archives, and they make that available via the internet. So with that, Kristen, I think we are done. I could minimize. There you go.
Okay, and I will go ahead and thank you for presenting. That was wonderful. If you have any questions for Andy, you can type them into the chat. And you're welcome to turn your videos back on now as well. If you can't turn on your video, just let me know in the chat. I think some people's I turned off at the beginning. But before I allow everyone to unmute themselves, I wanted to thank Andy, and I also wanted to let you guys know what's coming up next with the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. Next week, we will have a ride to Charleroi hosted by George Gula that will take us along the scenic line from Pittsburgh through Charleroi to Roscoe. And after that, we'll have a presentation about trolleys in Armstrong County from Dennis Kramer and a Johnstown show from Jim Graebner. And links to these to sign up, links to sign up for these are now on our website. And I will also, or actually earlier I shared a link to them in the chat, so I can share that again so you can click on it directly. And they are free. You'll notice when you sign up, there's an option to make a donation. And I want to thank everybody who did that for today's program and for some of the future programs as well. Zoom does have a viewer limit, so sign up early so it doesn't fill up. And that's not all that we're doing this fall. We've got fall themed Fridays at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, including some special tours like this Friday. We're having PCC Day pretty much. October 16th, we're doing a tour called Yinzer Trolleys. October 30th, Off the Rails, the fascinating second lives of our collection post-abandonment. So all sorts of fun tours in person at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. And you can purchase tickets online at patrolley.org. We'll also have a couple digital presentations that are not part of the Trolleyology series, but you can sign up for those as well, including one about car cards and trolley parks on October 9th and 23rd. And on Halloween and the day before, we'll have some harvest trolley tours about trolley freight, and there will even be some story times for the kiddos. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. Thanks for joining us. Your donation of any amount supports PTM's programs and helps us communicate the story of the trolley era. And let me go ahead and let you guys unmute once I find the button here. allow participants to unmute themselves. So if you would like to unmute, you can go ahead and do that. And Andy, we had a lot of comments about the marker lights. You can probably scroll up and see those comments. Lots of people had things to say, and there were some other really interesting comments during the show. But if anyone has questions, feel free to go ahead and ask.
Joe Warkany might be able to shed some light on those marker lights. What do you think, Joe?
Well, my understanding is that that particular design was unique to West Penn. As a matter of fact, on West Penn 832, when the car originally was built, it didn't have the marker lights, and they were installed by West Penn Railways. Okay. You had red lights, let's say, facing forward and backward, and then at 90 degrees to that, you'd have a green light, on the left or right side of the car. But there was a handle inside the car that the motorman or conductor could rotate that entire assembly so that you would change from, if you were facing the car, if you were looking at a red light, when you rotated it, then you were looking at a green light. Okay. And somebody else indicated with a chat comment that they were probably used for different purposes at different times. But I'm not an expert on exactly how they were used, but I do know that it was a unique design for West Penn.
I always kind of just thought that they were, red to the rear, green to the front, or whatever. But it's possible that there was a different purpose of them. As Joe,
well, that would have been my answer too. But I'm really not knowledgeable. Bill Franchek or somebody that really knows West Penn more completely than I do would know how they were used.
Ed Lightberger would probably know. He's our, not now resident West Penn expert. But I often wonder, could they be used? You have this single track with passing sidings, and if there's a second section following, a red light may have indicated to the operator of the opposing car, don't go yet, there's another car coming.
Do you think West Penn ran service that frequently?
Well, on a normal basis, no, but they could be running special cars for some reason, even if they were transferring cars between car barns. And I know during World War II, a lot of the coking operations that had been discontinued in the 30s and even earlier because Clairton began building, U.S. Steel began building Clairton Coke Works about 1918, and they continued to expand that. And that meant that instead of taking all this coke from tiny little ovens, you used to see those pictures, it was all coming directly by rail and by boat, by barge into Clairton. And that put a lot of people out of work down there in the 20s and 30s. But they reopened some of that during the war. Yeah. They just needed that capacity for more coke.
Yeah. Andy, are you looking for a copy of that Mckeesport book?
Yes, I would love a copy of that Mckeesport book.
There's a possibility. Have you checked in our store down at the museum?
I have not.
There may be copies of that book down there.
Okay.
Kristen can probably check for you and then hook you up. If not, I actually have a mint copy that's never been opened.
Wow.
We might be able to work something out if you can't find it at the store.
Okay. All right. Let me look at the store and I'll give you a shout. Thank you.
Okay. Kristen can tell you how to get a hold of me.
Will do.
I just opened up the full gallery view so I can see everybody's smiling face.
Yeah. Rogues Gallery.
Yeah. What's that, the usual suspects? Or?
I think so. There were a lot of positive comments in the chat. Everybody liked the presentation, it seems. So does anyone have any other questions or comments for Andy? He did say that he was, seeking feedback.
Well, I saw Andy, yesterday? It wasn't very long ago, maybe in the archives. And Andy was very concerned that he would have a program, that he wouldn't be proud of. And I can tell you that's exactly the opposite. He had stuff I never saw. before. You know, I've never been through these areas and realized how much of it was left. And so, you know, this was a fantastic program. And you know, I'm glad I went to this one and not to another Zoom meeting that continually conflicts on Tuesday. Because, Andy, I learned a heck of a lot from you today.
Oh, good. Well, thank you very much.
You got the George Gula seal of approval. That means a lot. That's like getting an Academy Award. Outstanding presentation. Really good job.
Thank you, Chris.
And we had Andy actually a couple months ago for our West Penn virtual trolley meet. He did a Pennsylvania Turnpike presentation. And Andy, you did some nice teasers of your other presentations during the show. So we'll have to maybe have you back again to do something else.
Terrific.
Yeah, anytime.
That sounds good. Well, thanks everybody for attending. I appreciate your attendance. Since you couldn't throw rotten fruit at me, take the money you were going to spend on the rotten fruit and make a donation.
Oh, man. All right. Well, thanks, Andy. Any last comments before we wrap up here? Some more nice comments in the chat. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our Trolleyology series. I guess you could call this season 2. Thank you, Andy, for sharing. And thanks to those who have already signed up for the next week's presentations as well. The links to the upcoming presentations are on our website. I also shared them in the chat box. This is recorded, but we'll decide what to do with it later, so to be announced. We'll figure that out shortly. But thank you again, everybody, for coming. We hope to see you next week. Thank you, Andy, and we'll see everybody again soon.
And thank you, Kristen.
Great group of people.
Good to see everybody, too.